Hey everyone, Chat Sematary is back. I'm your host, Deanna Chapman, and today I am once again joined by Terry Menard to discuss Mr. Mercedes Season 2. If you have not listened to our Season 1 episode, it was quite a few weeks ago. Since we're doing these by season and in chronological order, there's a bit of a gap here, but Terry, thank you for joining me once again.
Thanks for having me on. I had a great time talking in Season 1, and I am so excited to talk about this season because if you listen to the last episode that I was on, I've not read this book, so I have questions.
Okay. I love questions. I was surprised that they went this way with it and skipped ahead. So this season is covering End of Watch because, the first few episodes, I was like, okay, maybe they're just following up on Brady's story and then they're going to get into Finders Keepers. And, they never did. And I was like, oh, they're doing End of Watch. And it took me a few episodes to realize that because I was like, okay, maybe they're just shaking it up a little and giving us more of a Brady update than Finders Keepers did. But with End of Watch, you've read Finders Keepers though, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so in Finders Keepers, for anyone who needs a quick recap, we see the opening of Finders Keepers. We have a totally different case. We do get bits and pieces of Brady here and there, but, it's End of Watch when his character really comes back and everything sort of comes full circle. So, this season, I have to admit, we got a lot more scenes of Brady in the hospital than I was expecting.
Okay. If I have one complaint about this season, it's and I get it. You have an actor like Harry Treadaway. You need to give him something to do. But I did not really care for all of the scenes spent in his mind, and I really didn't care for the amount of time focused on him in the hospital. I get why they did that, and I think the reason probably why they decided to skip Finders Keepers for season 2 is because if you're going to try to complete the story, you need to have him and you need to make sure that you can tie him down for a second season as opposed to being like, hey, I need you to be in a couple episodes or a couple scenes if we're going to do Finders Keepers, and then you need to come back in the third season. I think they probably felt like we need to get this locked and loaded while we're done. It's unfortunate because this season feels kind of finite, and I kind of wonder, and I like we talked about last episode when we did Mr. Mercedes season 1, I kind of wonder if because this was on audience, if maybe they didn't know if they were going to get another season, and so they wanted to kind of find a way to tie up the season or tie up the story of him because season 1 does end with him in a coma, that we need to have sort of like an ending point to it. And I kind of wonder if that's why they did it this way, but I don't know. It feels a little too finite for me to then go on to a whole new case afterwards in the third season.
Yeah, because the way the books work really, and, I don't want to give away too much of the book since you haven't read it, but, Finders Keepers is, hey, Brady's in a coma. We don't need to spend time with him. Bill will go pop in and out of the hospital and, they can kind of move on with their lives. So I thought they were still going to do like another case with this, but instead they really do a lot of the things that are in the book, like the Zappets thing with those tablets. And they didn't explain that quite as well as I was hoping because
I was lost.
If I'm remembering correctly in the book, it was more like this company had bought them all up and was just giving them away for free. And that's how like Barbara and her friends got them. And, Barbara plays a bigger role in that sense in the book. And we already talked about how she was sidelined, so I wasn't surprised that she was still sidelined in this season. But, you can tell there's this obsession with the tablets. And I think they were hoping that would be enough, but they don't really explain it well enough. It's like this very specific fish game where you're tapping on different fish in different colors. And that is how Brady is sort of mind controlling people. But then you have Sadie, the nurse, who is epileptic and doesn't play the game. And I was like, oh, okay. And not to say I didn't like this season, because I did still have things that I enjoyed about this season, but it felt like if you had not read the book, like you said, you're going to have some questions.
I had a lot of structural issues in terms of the way that things were kind of laid out in this season. I do think overall there's some really great things, and I cannot wait to talk about this ending because the ending surprised the hell out of me. It started early where, because in season 1 we see Ida at a job and she is at a funeral parlor, and then here she is a teacher, or she is
Summer school.
oh, at summer school. I was like, I don't understand how she can go from that to now she's like teaching school,
Yeah.
and she's just handing out these red knockoff iPad type things, and I'm like, what? It's just one little scene, and I'm like, what is this doing in here? And then you start to see them show up a little bit later, and I'm like, I guess that's how he's controlling him, but it didn't really do anything for me. And I guess not having read the book, I was like, I don't understand why this is in here. I don't understand how he's able to control Sadie. I guess the epilepsy. I wasn't quite sure how he was able to control Al. I guess there was a lot of questions that I had in terms of how the logistics of his mind control was working.
There was some disconnect with it. I don't think it was too hard to understand that he was mind controlling people at all, but with him being able to like see through his eyes and then other people's eyes, and that whole thing where we're kind of inside his mind. And in the book, because Barbara does play a larger role in the books, you have her with one of the tablets, and we do see her in like 1 or 2 scenes with the tablet, and she's playing the game or whatever, and she's like, oh, I haven't gotten this high of a score before, or whatever it was in passing. And that plays a much bigger role, which makes it hit closer to home for Bill and Jerome specifically, because it's his sister, so you're missing that whole element of this. We do spend too much time in Brady's head. I would agree with that. Cora is a new character. Not that Dr. Babineau didn't have a wife in the book, but she just was, it was kind of like, she took on the Ida role almost this season, because she just kept popping in more and more, and, we were getting more and more familiar with her. And with that final episode, you really just have so much going on at that point. It's like, in season 1, you had moments where you had multiple big things happen. You had Janie's death. Then you had the scene in the final episode where he stabs Lou and he wants to bomb this place. And, you have multiple big events. Whereas here, because he's in a coma the whole time, the big events that happen, like Sadie committing suicide and everything that happens with Al, it just doesn't feel as big. It felt like, because those deaths weren't connected to any characters we really cared about. Sure, you have Bill's nurse friend at the hospital who obviously cared about Sadie and, that sort of thing. It just felt like those didn't hit on the same level.
They definitely weren't as impactful as the deaths in season 1, and I think you're hitting on exactly why it wasn't impactful for me too, because we don't know these people. Al's really, it's kind of a sad story in the middle because of he is not really understanding what is going on, and the scene where he kills his brother and then goes to try to kill Bill, it was sad, and it kind of added to this whole like ongoing tragedy that Mr. Mercedes started in the first season and kind of continues on here, but it just didn't hit as much as some of the deaths in the first season. And I don't think the moments throughout the entire season, ignoring the last episode, I don't think the events that were sort of the big kind of climactic moments were as powerful because of that here.
Yeah, you also have the fact that, in season 1, we talked about Brady's mother's death and how brutal and horrific that was. And then you have something in season 2 like Al's brother's death that just did not look good. Like when he slit his throat with the barber knife or whatever you call it. I don't know. I don't go to barbers, but, it just did not hold up as well as I think the mom's death did in season 1. It was one of those things I was like, that didn't remotely look real.
No, and it definitely does the thing that I hate, where this season has used computer generated blood. here and then also in the kind of climactic moment of this season, and it kind of cheapens the whole feel of it, if I'm going to be honest. I'm wondering if the budget wasn't as big as the first season. Because even though there are some crowd scenes here that have a lot more people than I ever saw in season one outside of the opening, I don't think that the effects work was done as well as season one. Particularly, I'm thinking again back to the mother's horrific death.
Yeah, let's talk about the death in episode 1, though, of this season, that I think we feel a little more than the rest in the season because, you know, Pete is Bill's former partner. He isn't necessarily a character you love or hate. He's just kind of a character who is there. And, you know, he's kind of the tough love for Bill. And, you know, he's like, dude, I have a job to do. And I just want to say, not what happens in the book. So I'll leave it at that for you.
Yeah, again, the tragedy feel and the trauma feel of this season, the fact that we have Pete retiring and he's like having all these plans about what he's going to do post retirement, and then he just sort of unceremoniously drops dead in Bill's kitchen. It was sad, and you're right. We don't really have much of a feeling on Pete other than he was the character that didn't really believe Bill in the first season, and he just sort of played sort of like the partner aspect and showed up once in a while. We care because he has a history with Bill, and so the fact that is like the first death of the season, I thought was also the most tragic aspect of it, because I was like, oh, I was happy to see him back, and then it's like, oh no, you're gone.
I do want to say that despite Pete's death happening so early in this season, it still felt like it didn't hit as hard because, you know, we weren't expecting it. But I feel like, you know, by the time you and I are sitting here talking about it, I almost forgot about it because it was just so sudden and kind of nonchalant.
It's very unceremonious. Yeah. And I honestly forgot that it happened until you mentioned Pete, and I was like, oh yeah, that's right, he did die at the beginning of the season. I just remember it kind of being like, oh, that's really sad because, you know, he's finally able to live his life after giving himself up to, you know, a career. And
yeah, and he seemed to play a bigger role in the books too, because, you know, Bill basically kept showing up at crime scenes, which he doesn't do quite as much. You know, he obviously shows up at everything that is related to like Brady's house and things like that. But what I recall from the books is that there were other murder scenes that Bill just kept showing up to. And Pete's new partner, Izzy, had a much bigger role in the books too, because she kind of had this tension between her and Holly. You know, they didn't like each other. And that is also missing from this. But I think because of the fact that they brought Ida in and made her such a focus in season 1, and then, you know, they bring Cora in as Dr. Babineau's wife, you had to cut something somewhere. And I think, you know, we see Izzy in a few scenes. She doesn't have a ton of lines in season 1, and we didn't even mention her in the season 1 episode. No. We didn't even really talk about Pete either, but I think that kind of just goes to show how almost forgettable they made those characters, unfortunately, until sort of Pete's death in this, and you're like, oh, that's a consequence we kind of weren't expecting.
Yeah, they were just sort of an obstacle in season 1, just sort of a plot-related obstacle to kind of give Bill a different roadblock in his kind of quest to take down Mr. Mercedes, and they didn't really feel like, I guess they really didn't feel like real people in that regard compared to the rest of the cast that the first season rolled out and kind of deepened a bit more here in season 2.
Yeah, one of the things that the End of Watch book does too is it kind of bounces back and forth between present day and the Mercedes killings. So, you know, it's kind of jumping back and forth timeline wise. And we don't get that in this season at all, really, except for, you know, a couple little things here and there with Brady, like seeing himself sitting in the car or something like that, I think. And they change a lot of Dr. Babineau's story too, because
do they?
I'm trying to do this without spoiling the book.
Please
for
go
you.
ahead, spoil. That's fine.
Okay. So in the book, he takes over Babineau like he does with Al.
Okay.
And, you know, he does it with Al too. I don't remember if that was exactly the character's name, but the guy with the library card. And he sort of builds up to taking over the doctor, and that's how he just gets out of the hospital because, he is kind of at the point where his body's not going to recover. He takes over the doctor's mind and body entirely and wants to kill Bill and Holly and Jerome. And, they kind of go out to this like cabin in the woods almost, and it's like super snowy and it's very hard to get there. And there's like this big showdown. And to just have Brady walk straight out of the hospital, I was like, oh, okay, sure. I guess we're going with that.
The characters in this season are not very smart. The DA in particular, Tony, the way that no one seems to realize that there's Lou who could, they're talking around, we need someone that's known him before and after, and all the people are dead. And I'm like, excuse me, what about Lou? And it takes forever for them to get to, oh my gosh, there's Lou. And then the idea that I don't know, the whole case, the whole courtroom aspect of trying to determine whether he is competent enough. It's one of those things that sounds really good on paper, but I do not think really kind of holds up when it's being talked about, because I'm sitting here thinking, isn't it suspicious that a pharmaceutical company is backing his defense when his defense is that he was a lab rat and that the pharmaceutical company changed him against his will? And I'm like, doesn't this seem a little bit suspicious and not going to hold up in court? And there's a lot of those kind of moments in here where I'm just like, this is not working. And Brady just walking out of the hospital just kind of continues on with that. And as much as I kind of appreciated the sort of like irony and the kind of companion piece of the first season, where in the first season he is able to kind of mentally convince people to kill themselves, and that is like what he does to the woman that owned the Mercedes car, and we have him as that sort of like figuratively controlling people, and here we have him literally controlling people. I thought it was kind of an interesting dynamic, but I don't think it's used as much because he literally just controls the nurse to have her jump off after a failed trying to kill Brady. And then Al, I'm like, this doesn't feel as fleshed out as I wanted it to be.
Yeah, I think they wanted us to really spend a lot of time looking at Brady's chapped lips.
Oh, yeah.
Which there were probably 20 too many of those shots. And again, I still enjoyed what they did because the way they changed things mostly made sense. The mind control stuff is a little iffy, but as far as the experimentation, the drugs, Babineau wanting to do it sort of for the recognition, and it's very clear that his wife is just so adamant about having everything go her way. Like, she's supposed to be this strong boss woman and at the same time, you really want to like characters like that because we see so few of them, but she's just so terrible.
She really is. The only positive note I wrote down on her was when she was talking about names for the baby, and her idea was a name that could be either gender, because what if the baby wants to transition later? I was like, yes, I like that. That's a good moment. And then everything else about her was just like, oh, you're kind of a horrible person. And it made me actually start to realize that a lot of the women in this, particularly this season, kind of fall into the camp of the supportive person or like the antagonist, because you have like all the people that are supporting Bill in terms of like Holly is that sort of supportive woman, and Ida is, and you have that, and Donna, and then you also have the sort of like evil woman, and there's like no in between. It's just you either are a supportive person that is doing everything you can to make the man succeed, or you are trying to manipulate the men and make them do things for your will. And it just that dichotomy, it just like we have two different kinds of women in this, and that's about it.
Yeah, it's funny. I just quickly looked up the Wikipedia page for the series, and it says here that on Rotten Tomatoes, season 1 has an 83% out of 29 reviews overall. And then season 2 has 100% from 11 reviews overall. And I'm just like,
Not many people
kind
saw
of
it.
surprised that this got a bump with season 2, because it's the same with the Metacritic score. that one is 71 with more reviews than season 2, but season 2 got a 76 out of 100. And, I think maybe if you haven't read the books, this is okay. You've read 2 out of 3, so you kind of already got to know Brady through the books. And to have this be sort of flipping spots with Finders Keepers as far as the show goes, I imagine it was a little confusing because you're like, hold on, I don't think this is where book 3 was going. And it is, but it isn't. In the book, he also has like other things going on, like he can move objects and he turns water on and off, and just smaller things that kind of feel like they're building up to something. I felt like we didn't have that build up.
No, and that was one thing that, because I did read Finders Keepers, and I remember the scenes in there where like the hospital staff is spooked because they're seeing things move, and they're starting to think that maybe he's controlling it. And that was an interesting aspect of it because it's subtly introduced as in terms of like a more supernatural or otherworldly aspect of the story that kind of gets introduced slowly in Finders Keepers, and then I guess is kind of going ham in End of Watch. And here, I think when you go from a very grounded, down to earth, procedural type story from season 1, and then all of a sudden it's like, nope, we are talking mind control. We're taking an inspiration from Frankenstein. We are literally going to call him Frankenstein, which is ironic because Harry Treadaway played Frankenstein in Penny Dreadful, and here he is being with Frankenstein's monster here in this. And I was like, oh, I see what you're doing here. But it's such a sudden shift between the 2 seasons that it made me feel a little discombobulated because I'm like, how is this going from a very grounded first season to a more otherworldly aspect of it in such a quick moment?
Yeah, because with the books, you have that build up through Finders Keepers. You don't really know what's going to happen with Brady. He's not dead. He's going to come back in some way, shape, or form. And in this, you don't get that beat. You don't get to take time away from Brady, which they could have done. They could have just thrown in some, little cases, and, they kind of do that. But at the same time, they kind of threw in Sadie's mom more. And I was just like, this is okay. And again, I still enjoyed this. I am looking forward to season 3, which I have not started yet when we're recording this. And, we didn't do any ratings for season 1, and we probably won't do any here. I do think I want to kind of do that as a whole once we talk about season 3, because, with the books, they do stand on their own, but I think once you read all 3 in full, it really just gives you this bigger picture. It's kind of like reading the Dark Tower books, but for detective stories. King is very good at giving you this piece of the story that is a beginning, middle, and end, but also just the beginning of the full story.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Could we talk about this ending though? Because I thought this ending was fascinating. I was a little I wouldn't say bored, but I was a little confused. I didn't know what to expect in this last episode because Brady, of course, turns himself in episode 9. And I'm like, okay, what are you trying to do here? What is your ultimate goal? Because we know he's not changed. We know he's still, a vicious sociopath at this point, even though everyone else seems to be completely hoodwinked by him, which was like, whatever. But we have this ending that is like the exact opposite of season 1 ending, where season 1 had a more bombastic, even though it was a little muted in terms of what happens in the book, with the like sort of explode the idea that he's going to blow himself up and make his masterpiece. And here we have a courtroom drama reduced to 1 episode, but it bringing back Lou, who I wanted more of this season, because they did a really good job in the beginning, kind of in keeping her alive, or keeping her character arc alive. And then she sort of vanishes a little bit in the mid to like last part of it. And then she comes back in around to like bring everything home. But I loved the scene I loved the best in here. And the scene I thought that was the most subtle character work was the discussion between Lou and Brady, where she is like talking to him. And you can tell that I was just thinking about how horrible for her this would feel, where she's stabbed, she's having to face the person that almost killed her. And she even says kind of did kill her in one point.
Yeah.
And that whole scene I thought was just such a fascinating way to end, or way to set up the end of this season.
I was very, very uncertain once I was like, oh, they're going to actually do Law and Order here, because none of this stuff was in the book,
Okay.
with the way the book ends there, the whole Law and Order thing is just kind of not part of the story in the book. And I think that scene where Lou meets the quote unquote new Brady makes up for it, because it was in that moment I was like, they are putting this character through hell. Mm-hmm. And she's literally the only one who can stop whatever is about to happen, because everyone else felt helpless. The prosecutor felt helpless. Bill and Holly could not do anything. Jerome couldn't do anything. Bill was brutally attacked by Al too, not too long before this. And you have these characters who, by the way, his ex-wife does play a much bigger role in this as well. She's kind of just mentioned in passing here and there in the books, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes, I completely forgot that she was a thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And, she has a more prominent role. She's kind of like trying to take care of Bill and go see their daughter and do all these things.
Nancy Travis, though.
Yeah.
I love her. So I Married an Axe Murderer. I love her.
Yeah. And, I think this buildup with Lou and Brady really made me feel okay with how this ended. And we know how smart both of these characters are because they did all of that work in season 1. Just because they were working at a computer store, doesn't mean they weren't capable of doing things outside of that computer store that involved tech and whatnot. So, to completely spoil it here for anyone listening, if you're listening and haven't watched this, maybe stop now. But you have Lou going in to testify, and this is basically a competence hearing. It's not the actual trial. The trial didn't even, get to its official starting point with the jury or anything. This is just to determine Brady's competence. She gets on the stand. She answers all of the questions. You really feel like she's doing a great job. And, Brady's lawyer doesn't really attack her in the way I was expecting, which surprised me. And I was pleasantly surprised by. I was glad they didn't go that way with it. And then she just pulls out this 3D printed gun and shoots him in the eye.
Oh my God. When she was on the stand, all I kept thinking was, yes, leave it to a queer woman to solve all of your straight people's problems and, and get him to justice. And then the moment that the defense attorney he's just sitting there and he's calmly like, have you ever seen him cry before? And all this kind of stuff. And just kind of poking holes into every little thing that she says, even though everything that she says should have been enough to make it seem that he is competent to go to trial. He just pokes holes, and she walks up to him at the very end and says, I do not forgive you. I do not. And blam. I was gagged. I was shocked. I was like, I cannot believe that just happened.
Yeah, I did not see it coming. I mean, we
No.
see her buy a real gun. And you're like, okay, obviously she can't take that to the courtroom. And they don't do any setup for this. We don't see it coming. And, she's so unsure of herself and whether or not she's going to be able to do this. And the fact that she did this after not really being attacked on the stand, but just, she knew.
Yes. Yes, I was like, oh my God. And I am curious, because I did look up on IMDb and I know that she's going to be in season 3. And I'm just curious to see what's going to happen with her, because the season sort of ends, even though it has like a finite ending in terms of Bill's like storyline. Like they could have ended the show after this if they hadn't gotten a 3rd season, and it would have given his story a little bit of a closure. I was still going there. What's happening with her? Because he's at the very end just happily painting, and I'm like, but what about the person that saved the day? What happened with her? And I wanted to know, so I'm it actually made me really excited to start watching the next season, because I really related to her character, and I thought that they did a good job, even though she does vanish partway through the season. of like showing this sort of survivor's remorse and wanting to know why did I survive when he could have easily have killed me, and just the loneliness that she felt. I really thought this season did a good job of portraying that sort of like victim PTSD aspect of it.
Especially when the guy starts following her, you know,
Oh,
and she beats the crap out of him. And,
mm-hmm.
you know, she gets off on it because you can tell this guy, he doesn't like other people telling him what to do. And he definitely does not want to admit that this woman beat the crap out of him. So, you know, he's not pressing charges or anything like that. So, you know, she gets out and you see the struggle with her. And this character played a much bigger role than I really expected, given what we see of her in the books. And, you know, different name in the books. It's Freddie Linklater in
Oh,
the
okay.
books. And I think, you know, just kind of changing things up a little bit makes sense for TV a lot of times, especially when you are dedicating 10 episodes to something, you know. You mentioned watching Lacey's story recently, and that was 8 episodes. And even that felt long. And
Should have been 6.
I agree. I did like it, but you know, that's for another episode. But with this, you have to tread very carefully when you're covering a trilogy. You know, we mentioned how production wise and schedule wise, it made sense to flip books 2 and 3 just so you get a complete story, because you're right. If they would have done Finders Keepers and not had the Brady storyline wrap up and they didn't get renewed for a season 3, it's kind of like, oh no. And I think, you know, the only thing I can think of as far as why this would be safe is because AT&T had complete control. They weren't pitching it to another network. They owned the network. So, you know, sure, the executives still could have canceled it, obviously, as many do with TV shows. But I think maybe because it was on a smaller platform and a smaller channel that not as many people had access to, it had a higher likelihood of them just telling the stories they wanted to tell with all 3 seasons. But, you know, I've seen things where people want a season 4 and things like that. And I'm like, I don't know if I would want more seasons of this, because there are definitely shows that are on much longer than they should be, to put it nicely. You know, I am someone
Yes.
who watches all of the CW DC shows because of reasons that I don't totally understand, but so many of them are just still going. And I'm like, I think we need to stop, team.
Yeah. Okay. Speaking of the DC aspect, though, what this season really hammered home is sort of like it made me kind of chuckle a couple times, because they're really kind of like focusing in on the sort of Joker Batman connection between Bill and Brady, where at one point, I think it's Ida even tells him, "You're an addict and Brady is your drug, and he
Yes.
made your life richer, more exciting. He brought you back from the dead, Bill." And which might explain why you're trying to bring him back from the dead. I wrote that line down because I'm like, okay, you are really hammering home this, like, we need each other. We're like the flip of the coin. We're the joke. You're the Joker to my Batman, and that's something that this season in particular, they sort of did a little bit in season 1, but this season really hammered home with like. There's a scene where Bill is having trouble peeing. He's having trouble urinating, and it cuts between him peeing and Brady peeing into like the bag in his hospital. And there's like in season 1, there was the scene where Bill is like dancing with Janie while Brady is like will they won't they with his mom at one point. And so there's these aspects of it that this season and last season, but this season in particular, sort of like focused in on that sort of addiction, that sort of like he is your Joker aspect of it.
Yeah. I think one thing, maybe 2 things this season could have done is take away from the shots of him just lying in the bed and take away some of those workout scenes. My goodness.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking, what is the mystery here? Because first season didn't really have necessarily mystery. We know who did the crime. We know who the bad guy is, but it's sort of a cat and mouse. Here we don't really have a cat and mouse game that plays out. I mean, I guess a little bit in terms of him sending different people to go try to kill Bill, but like there was no mystery to it. And the mystery for me was like, how is he doing this? And that was sort of half baked, and it never really was completely to my satisfaction answered, other than like, it was this device, it was this go fish game, it was, the drugs, but there was nothing that like kept me interested in Brady's storyline. And I actually kind of wish that they had left it a little bit open-ended in the beginning as to what is really going on with like the nurse that commits suicide, or, Al that finally turns violent. Like if they interjected these things where the characters would say something that obviously were to infer Brady is talking through them, but it would have been, I think, a little bit more impactful if it was sort of like left up to the imagination through the beginning part as to what is really going on, instead of hammering home that we are seeing Brady in his control center back in his basement. I get that they wanted to have Harry do something more than just be in an occasional scene or two and give him more of a meaty role. Because if I was an actor, I probably would want, if I'm coming back for a season, I'd want to have a much more meatier role than just being a patient in a hospital bed. But I don't know. It kind of took away the tension for me.
Yeah, it felt like they just kind of lingered too long on those things. I don't think they should have cut them completely, but, just thinking off the top of my head here, it might have been a little better paced if they had Bill and Holly going after Cora more, because they find out all of this stuff about her and they do absolutely nothing about it.
Nothing. Yeah.
They just end up watching her on TV and they're all like, oh, she's good.
Yeah. She's going to do the Fox News circuit. That's basically what I got out of her character from them.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think maybe take away some of those lingering shots of Brady in the bed, Brady working out, because we did still get plenty of scenes where people are going into the room to visit him and he's there, or he's looking through Sadie's eyes or Al's eyes. And, he has all of those moments where we could still see him in his head. And, that scene with Roby where dead Roby is, helping him figure out how to mind control people. And, there were just some things that I think could have been cut down a little and made room for more interesting storylines and plot points that they could have followed, because they definitely set up all of that stuff with Cora and then it was dead in the water.
Yeah, a lot of really good ideas. I just don't think the execution was that great, unfortunately, in some regards. But I loved the final episode of this, even though I was like, oh, we're gonna get a courtroom scene. And I think overall the season sort of does a good job of tying everything together and making the ending feel stronger than maybe some of the events leading up to it would imply. But yeah, I don't know. In terms of the entire season, I think I actually prefer the first season better.
Yeah, I do too. And I think the good thing about season 2 is that it still makes us invested in the main characters, Bill and Holly are kind of in this tense spot because Bill keeps going and doing things that's putting the business in jeopardy, and Holly's like, you're gonna sign this thing so that I don't lose the company because you're being stupid, and he's like, okay, that's fair. And you have little moments like that I think still keep our attention enough and keep us invested in these characters enough. And you have Jerome and his struggle with Harvard, which they could have gone into a little more. And you mentioned earlier, and I totally did not really answer you on this, about Ida and the funeral home. And there's a very quick passing moment where she's like, I inherited that. That's not what I enjoy doing. That's not my passion. And she was like, this is why I teach summer school, because I used to do this and I kind of wanted to get back to it. And,
completely missed that.
It was so quick. It was honestly so easy to miss. And, we're probably all guilty of looking at our phones or tablets or whatever while we're watching stuff, especially something like this season where it was definitely slower than season 1. And you're like, okay, Brady's in the hospital bed again, Yeah. So it was definitely just like a quick 5-second line or something like that. And I feel like it still held my attention enough and I still enjoyed it to where I'm actually really interested in how they're going to portray the Finders Keepers novel now, because they don't have that whole aspect of Brady hanging over Bill's head.
Yeah. I wanted to go back because you mentioned the sort of Holly and Bill aspects
Yes.
of this, and I actually wanted more of that because one of my favorite parts of this season was early on when he is kind of teaching her how to be a private detective, and it's sort of like these moments of it kind of made me laugh where he's like, okay, I want you to do a 3-part turn, and she's like, what is that? And he's like, do a Yui, and he's like trying to teach her how to take over the job in case he's no longer doing it and she wants to have a successful business. And I love the scene where he's like, all right, now you're going to sit out here and you're going to watch this house and you're going to call me if she, stirs. And then she's like, okay, it's the next day. And he's like, yep, you're going to keep doing this for another 24 hours. And I'm just like, it's moments like that I was like, okay, I like that there is a little bit of more progression in terms of their character, more progression in terms of this business that all of a sudden stood up overnight. In between seasons, like I'm sure there's time that passed between it, but for us it's like all of a sudden boom, they're doing a private detective agency. So I enjoyed that we were getting a little bit more of the relationship building between the two of them, because once we get to the back half of the season, it's more him and trying to nail Brady down, and so it's like we kind of lose that relationship that was barely introduced in season 1, and I felt was started to kind of progress here, and then just sort of kind of took a back seat in terms of the plot. But I liked that earlier segment with her.
Yeah, we didn't talk about the prosecutor too much, and I feel like he was that character who was, supposed to be the quote unquote good guy, and you find out he's kind of not, and then, his dog, very sympathetic to that. And you have sort of that whole storyline too that I think really took over, but still required us to spend a lot of time with Brady, which I think was a little unfortunate. But I had no expectations going into this. Like we both said in season 1, we didn't really know what to expect. I had heard it was good from maybe a few people who were able to watch it when it was on. But I still think that even though this season differs quite a bit from End of Watch, it was still good TV. It wasn't something where I was like, oh, you know what? I don't feel like watching season 3 now. Obviously, I can't be like that. I have to watch it. I have told myself that I have to do this for whatever reason I decided. But, I'm very interested in season 3 because of the changes they made this season.
Yeah, I'm going into season 3 excited to see what's going to happen with Lou, and I'm excited to see this story that I've more recently read the book on. So like I have that more in my mind, and I'm curious to see what they're going to change. And I am kind of spoiler alert. I did look and see Nancy Travis is not in season 3. So whatever happened with him and his ex-wife is apparently not going to happen at all in season 3. It's just unceremoniously dropped. Maybe they couldn't get her to come back for another season, but
she does play Tim Allen's wife in Last Man Standing, so maybe she was busy with that at the time. So, I only know that because my parents watched that show, and they're like, "Oh, that lady." I was like, "Yes, that is who that is."
And see, my connection is from the '90s with "So I Married an Axe Murderer." That's my connection with her.
Possibly a more fun connection there. But,
yes.
Terry, thank you so much for joining me. This was fun to discuss. Not as good as season 1, not terrible TV either by any means, really. We were kind of nitpicking here. But I think, we'll certainly have quite a bit to talk about with season 3 with no more Brady Hartsfield. So I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Me too.
All right, that does it for this episode of Chat Sematary. You can support the podcast on Patreon for $1 a month. You'll get a thank you on the show. For $2 a month, I will send you a Chat Sematary sticker. And if you want to follow us on social media, you can do so at Chat Sematary on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You could also rate and review the show. That's a huge help. And as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.